process. There we go. And we are recording this session, as you can see. So the themes are participation, process, equity, collaboration, and systemic change. So we hope to see you at other festival sessions as well. We've got loads coming up next week too. And we will be tweeting and posting on LinkedIn. So do keep an eye out for that. We're using the hashtag Festival of Learning 24, which my colleague will pop in the chat. And as I said, we are recording, and if there are things that you don't want broadcasted, just let us know in the chat. And we are also encouraging people to keep your camera off and engage with the session, and let us know which organisation you're joining us from in the chat. So yeah, we hope you enjoy, and I'm going to hand over to Sarah from NPC, or is it Claire that's kicking us off?
I'm going to kick off. So thanks so much for that, and thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to be part of this session today, and to be part of the Festival of Learning this year. So in this session, we're going to be exploring how funders can balance three key elements: trust, evidence, and equity in their monitoring, evaluation, and learning practice. I'm Sarah Denselow, and I'm with NPC. We're a think tank and consultancy for the charity sector, and we've got a long history of sort of pushing forward measurement practices, as well as encouraging funders to support organisations with greater flexibility in their giving. In my role, I lead our effective philanthropy grant making stream. I work directly with funders to support and manage their grant making, and so we hear about these tensions between wanting to be light touch while also wanting to get data to understand what we're achieving with our giving. So we've been wanting to explore how we can best manage some of these tensions, and also to ensure that we're doing things in ways which promote greater equity, which we know is so important. So in our session today, my colleague Claire Gordon is going to be setting out some of our thinking today on how we can design approaches that kind of balance these various tensions. We're also really pleased that we're going to be joined by two speakers: Asimina Vergou, Head of Learning and Impact at the Co-op Foundation, and Corinna Philpott, Head of Impact and Learning at Comic Relief. And they'll be sharing examples and reflections from their own works and how they're putting these ideas into practice, and what balancing these tensions looks like for them in their work. And then at the end, we're going to have some time for questions, and also, especially because we've got a big group here today, and we're really keen to hear from you. We will be using some sort of interactive tools. We've got a Miro board where we're really keen to hear from you about what practices you've been employing, what you've been learning through your work, and what you'd like to hear more about in future. So please do, as we're going through, use the chat to share any questions that you might have. And as Melanie said, please introduce yourselves in the chat as well. We're going to be using Menti and Miro during the session. So I'm going to start off. We wanted to start off by just asking a few questions to sort of set the scene. So I don't know how many of you will have used Menti before, sorry, but if you may be familiar with it, but to use this software, just type in either menti.com into a web browser. So if you open a new web browser, type in menti.com followed by the code that you see at the top of the screen, or you can scan the QR code here that you see on the screen. And we'd be really keen to get your thoughts on this question. So how much of your grantee report data do you use? All of it? Quite a lot? Some of it? Not much, or none? So we'll just wait a moment while people are filling in. It's a mixed picture, clustering around the middle, which is always nice. None. Someone's saying using none. Nobody is saying that they use all of it. Is anybody going to put their head above the parapet and say that they use all of their grantee report data? Somebody does. Yeah. Okay. So a nice curve there. Most people in the room are saying that they use some of the data, whether that's a lot or just a little bit, a bit of a mixed picture, but relatively less at either ends of the spectrum. So only one person responding to the survey saying that they use all of the data that they get in their grantee reports. one participant saying that they use none at all. So this is interesting, I think, with in the context of discussions around trust and balance in evaluation practice, kind of the importance of being intentional about what you're asking for, and thinking about how you're using your grantee data. We're interested to hear your thoughts about this. So I think if we move on to the next question, so what if you refresh your Menti link, you should get this new question. What data do you collect from your grantees that you tend not to use? Are there things in particular that you tend not to use? Number of volunteers. Interesting. What else? Are there any other common themes in the data that you collect but you're not using in your reports? References, interesting. More of the qualitative information. Useful context, yeah. Interesting to reflect on how how as funders we're kind of using that contextual background information. Where does that feed into our practice? Progress on outcomes, demographics. Interesting. Okay, that's okay. Use a lot, but that's a problem on what's valued, included, and measured. Interesting. So thinking about what's the kind of priority information that you're getting from your reports, and where does it all feed in? It might all feed in at different points in your sort of grant making process. And lots of stuff on the contextual background, kind of demographics, data changes in local area. Where does that go to inform our funding practice? Okay, I think maybe we'll move on. We've got one more question that we wanted to ask. So this is around thinking about your learning. Where do you get your best learning? Is it grantee reports? Is it grantee calls? Is it visits to your grantees? External sources, evaluations, grants data, somewhere else? Visits. Visits coming out strongly, and reports. Interesting. Yeah. That's really interesting. So yeah, there's quite a strong vote for the grantee reports, which I'm sure grantees will be happy to hear that those are valuable. But it seems like there's quite a strong swing towards the visits, as being really important from learning point of view, and often nothing can compare to seeing something for yourself. So that's really interesting. I'm also struck that nobody has said external sources. So the best learning comes from the grantees themselves rather than from other sources. Ali has said in the chat, I guess this question also depends on your role within the organization. Yes. And potentially also on what you're using that learning for. Like where is that learning feeding in to your organization? Okay. Great. So there was just some questions to get us started off. But I'm going to hand over now to Claire, who's going to talk us through some of our thinking to date.
Unmute, there we go. Hi everyone, I'm Claire Gordon. I'm a principal consultant at MPC. I'm focused on funder evaluation and learning. So I wanted to kind of introduce a bit about the work that we're doing at the moment and set out some of our thinking to date. So what are we doing? We are creating what we hope will be a very practical tool to support different kinds of funders to develop their kind of monitoring, evaluation and learning approaches, guided by the principles of trust, so more open, flexible grant making, as well as evidence, which we obviously believe underpins good decision making, and equity. So we're hoping that in doing so, we might enable funders to be more flexible and trusting in their grant making practices, including among funders with higher accountability requirements. We've seen there's a lot of people joining from local councils in the chat, and we know that accountability requirements really vary hugely between different kinds of organisation. So not everyone can just strip away their reporting requirements to a bare minimum. So we've been drawing on lots of different kinds of sources to build the framework, and I should say it's very much a work in progress. We're really keen to get some of your feedback, some of your experiences later in the session, but we've been speaking with charities, we've spoken with funders, we've drawn on our own work with clients, and kind of a lot of the good work that's been happening within the sector around this. I think it's important to reference IVAR's Open and Trusting Grant Making program, which did some work on reporting, which has been a kind of inspiration and which we've been drawing on in our work too. But yeah, I think we're looking to develop something which funders can sort of pick up and use as a basis for kind of either reviewing what they're doing already or kind of starting to develop their approaches or kind of further develop their approaches too. So what's the problem? So we held some discussion groups with charities who shared some of their experiences of reporting, and we heard some of their frustrations, which will be familiar to many of you. So the first quote: "We're never asked to evaluate the funder. We're being asked by one of our principal funders how to support artists with disabilities. We do a lot of that, but they have incredibly inaccessible hoops. Having a two-way evaluation process would be amazing." So this speaks to some of the imbalances in evaluation, where the lens is generally on the organisation which is being supported, not on the funder. And this tension, I think, becomes much more acute when we're thinking about issues of equity, diversity, accessibility. So second quote: "I don't know if funders read reports, to be honest. They probably read the first couple of paragraphs and then lose interest and on to the next one. Sometimes they copy and paste things for the trustees. Why are we wasting our time doing these massive reports that get skimmed over?" So there's a feeling that reporting is of little value, both to funders and grant holders. I thought it was interesting seeing your responses that maybe reports are looked at more actually than charities realise, but that's not the sense that they get necessarily. But having that lack of kind of clarity or transparency over what the data is being used for cements some of that inequality in the relationship between funder and funded. But equally, we know funders are struggling to balance this. We are struggling to balance this in our own work. So how can we create monitoring evaluation systems that have real learning value? How can we build accountability whilst being as light touch as possible? So these are some of the questions which have been sort of animating our work. So we thought it'd be useful to start with some core principles that we think underpin a balanced approach. So first off, intentionality. So what do you need to know? What do you want to know? Why? Are you asking the right questions? And we're going to go into this during our session in quite a lot of detail. The second, making the best use of what you've got. I guess it seems that most people feel that they're not making the best use of their reporting data. We know it can take a lot of resource to do that properly as well, but it's something that we need to kind of consider closely, obviously, before kind of collecting that data. Third, turning the lens on yourself as a funder. We know a lot of funders are doing this increasingly through surveys, group discussions. Unsurprisingly, perhaps a lot of the feedback they receive is very positive. So how do you do this in ways where you can get good data doesn't feel excessively burdensome, like yet another thing that people have to do for their funder, and that you can kind of enable more honest responses or an honest assessment of your performance. So the fourth is looking outwards. So this is both about lightening the burden on what we're asking for funded partners, where we're expecting to be kind of drawing our learning from, as well as recognizing that so much important learning sits outside of our grants. And I think Sarah highlighted, it was interesting that no one selected kind of external sources as their sort of primary source of learning or their best source of learning. So fifth, embedding equity throughout the process. So we'll be going into quite a lot more detail in what this can look like during the session with our guest speakers. And then lastly, clarity and transparency, which really underpins a lot of this. And especially, I think, for funders who have very high accountability requirements, being really clear about why you need the data, what it's being used for, why you can't not ask for the data in some instances, and having that distinction for charities will be helpful in understanding whether this is about assessing their performance or it's really about kind of risk management, and those can entail slightly different things for charities, perhaps in how they feel about sharing the data too. So moving on. So now kind of thinking through how we can be more intentional. So I think when thinking about a balanced approach, a key starting point is reflecting on what we're doing and what we're not doing in relation to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. There's obviously lots and lots of different approaches which can sit underneath these categories, and some of them cross over these different categories too, from reporting, check-in calls, visits, evaluations, shared measurement, Funder Plus, collective learning, research, etc. There's also clearly a lot of softer ways in which we can do learning, and generally evaluation learning should, we would hope, have a very strong overlap too, that a lot of the evaluation you're doing would be in the service of learning rather than just in the service of kind of accountability and improving. But how this will look very different for different funders, rightly so. So thinking about larger funders, there we go. A lot of larger funders will separate out evaluation and learning from monitoring. These might happen in quite different places. There's a grants management team who might look at monitoring, and the evaluation and learning team will, look at those aspects and run kind of quite different activities. This obviously enables a much greater focus on learning, and also can have the advantage of separating that learning out from the accountability and maybe enable better, more honest learning. But that can also create risk duplication, so that kind of grant holders get requests from different individuals within an organization. They're asked to share similar information in different formats, and it might also mean that reporting data isn't used as well as it might be too. But for many smaller funders, understandably, the focus might be more on monitoring. They won't have the resources to do that kind of evaluation and learning. But in doing so, they're missing out on learning. Are they meaningfully able to kind of evaluate their work and their performance? So how can we do monitoring in the service of learning? So what do you need or want to know? So this is another important aspect of intentionality, and we think defining learning questions can be a useful exercise. So thinking about those three different levels: organizational level, grant level, and thematic level. And within that organizational grant level, looking at those kind of turning the lens questions, so assessing your own practice as well as those impact questions. And then it can kind of center equity within those questions too. At a thematic level, you might think about how different groups are affected by the issues that you are seeking to address, but also taking that kind of more systemic lens and looking outwards. So what are the wider factors? What are the different kinds of approaches within the areas in which we're funding? And when defining these questions, you can also think about what are the needs of other organizations, individuals within the sector, draw on, help or involve people with lived experience in defining these questions and kind of setting the learning agenda too. So what sources of data can you draw on? Sorry, next slide, please. So in order to work out the right balance, we also need to be intentional about the data sources we're using. How do these match up to what we want to know? I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's obviously a huge range of different sources that we could draw on. So thinking through, actually, are we making the most of these sources? Are we addressing the different kind of things that we want to know? And are we picking the right ones too? And I think this kind of exercise, this kind of mapping exercise or thinking through this can also help think through whether there are ways to shift the balance to using more of your internal data as well as external data too. So what could this look like in practice? So thinking about this question, how equitably are we funding? We could draw on all sorts of different data to try understand this, build a kind of richer assessment of our practice too. So from aligning to the DEI data standard, which is something one of our speakers is going to touch on, reviewing our internal processes or reviewing our processes that could be done both internally or externally. So there's the foundation practice rating, which is providing an assessment of how funders are doing in relation to diversity, accountability, transparency. Also drawing on kind of perceptions from our grant holders through a survey or check and call, and thinking about how existing evidence data can also help us understand the equity issues better. So how are inequalities manifesting in the issues we support, and then how does our grant making sort of match up to that? So the last thing I wanted to highlight in relation to this kind of intentionality point is thinking through proportionality a bit and what that could actually mean. I think it's a very multifaceted concept. So as well as being about an organization size, it's also about the types of organization you're supporting, the sectors in which they're operating, and that might have really different implications for the kinds of data they're used to gathering or sharing. It's also obviously about the size of your grant and the size of your grant relative to the organisation, but the sort of absolute size of your grant. But I think something that the charities we spoke to pointed out, that grant length really matters a lot too, in kind of if they're going to develop some kind of tailored approach to monitoring the impact of your grant. And then that final question, really, what's at stake? What is this information leading to? Is this meaningfully going to influence a grant decision or a strategy decision, or is this more about communication and risk? And I think when there are significant differences in one of these factors within a pool of grant holders or different funds, we need to think about adapting requirements or being flexible. So now I was going to talk a little bit more about embedding equity in your MEL practice and some work we did as part of the Equitable Evaluation Collaborative. Some colleagues of mine did last year as part of the Equitable Evaluation Collaborative, before sort of handing on to our speakers. So so first off, the equitable evaluation, what is it? For those not familiar, equitable evaluation is about using evaluation as a tool for advancing equity. It does this by exploring who is making decisions about evaluation, whose knowledge and voice is valued in the process, and what purpose the evaluation serves. So it's both about the process, how you evaluate, and doing this in an equitable way, as well as the outcomes, so evaluating in the service of equity. So the reports we did had some suggestions for funders and how they could kind of integrate equity into their evaluation practice. So first off, creating values alignment. So MEL practices will obviously flow from kind of wider organizational practices, culture, values, ethos. So we can't just shift the kind of MEL, but that needs to be sort of led through other kind of frameworks within the organization. And, I guess, and we'd hope that those would center equity too, and then the evaluation and approach, or the MEL approach, can kind of flow from that. So consider if you can use evaluation to advance equity. So can you use it to develop insights, maybe about barriers to equity in your own practice, or to understand or develop the evidence base to tackle systemic inequalities, thinking about how different groups might be affected by an issue, for example. And how can we, and then creating space for co-creation and involvement. So that's something that our speakers are going to talk about in a bit more detail, how they've brought this into their work. And there's, I guess, a lot of opportunities to involve both kind of organizations as well as individuals with lived experience potentially in developing your approaches, and it might be in kind of defining the kind of outcomes that you want to see, as well as thinking through those learning priorities. Then planning the timeframe and budget to meaningfully centre equity. This can require additional resource. Then lastly, being accountable for using evaluation and learning recommendations. So sharing the findings and saying what you're going to do to respond to them, being transparent about that. So I now wanted to hand over to Asimina Vergou, who's the head of impact and learning at the sorry, I've just realized that Asimina doesn't seem to be in the room at the moment. So I'm going to hand over to Corinna from Comic Relief, who's going to talk to us about their approach to collective learning.
Yes, no problem. Hello everyone, I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see if that works. I've just got some very simple slides, just for those who like to have something to look at, rather than just hearing me talk. 1 second. Hopefully you can see something that says collective learning and has our Comic Relief logo on it as well. Fab, I see some nodding, so that's good. And nodding means people can hear me, which is also good. So hello everyone, my name is Corinna Philpott. I am the head of impact and learning at Comic Relief. I'm really happy to be here. I'm very interested in what Claire, you've been talking about. I should also say I've been at Comic Relief for over 2 years, held several roles in what is the monitoring, evaluation and learning team, and have been responsible for overseeing what we call collective learning programs, as well as overseeing the team. And now stepping into this head of role, it's more about thinking about how we better use the learning that we have. So I'm going to dive straight in to try and explain to you what collective learning is, because it isn't, again, it's a piece of jargon, but it's also quite specific to Comic Relief. So it's evolved over the years into what is our main approach that we use at Comic Relief. We commonly use this more than evaluation, actually, which is normally reserved for our co-funded programs because it is often a requirement of our co-funders. But we've done a lot of sense-making work. It's kind of evolved organically over the years as an approach, I think, with the intention of previous teams to be more equitable, to think about how better to include our funded partners. Funded partners is what we call our grantees in learning work. So we have done a lot of sense making to try and be able to better explain what it is, how we do it, and also what challenges we know we still need to address with it, which I touch on at the end. But in terms of what it is, the way we understand it is that it's the way to make the most of the expertise and knowledge held by our cohorts of funded partners by creating opportunities for them to share and reflect with each other. So we invite cohorts of funded partners who are part of a broader program that might have an issue area, a geographical focus, a variety of those things, to be part of collective learning. It's not something that is a condition of their funding. They're invited to be involved, but they often do choose to opt in. It's facilitated by a learning partner or a learning coordinator, and that person is, or that organisation is, commissioned and managed by Comic Relief's MEL team. They're often local, regional consultants with expertise in the thematic area or with contextual knowledge, and also with a variety of other skills. As I've said, the collective learning programs have been implemented with a variety of the cohorts, so UK-based, international, mixture of both, different issue areas as well. And they would last for the entire program, which is on average about 3 years. We don't have a standard way of commissioning or recruiting learning coordinators. We don't have a standard terms of reference. Our intention here is to be quite open and flexible with the approach so that we can be responsive to the needs of the cohort. But what commonly has come through when we've looked at the various ways we have done commissioning, we often use words like being partner-led, adaptive, flexible, collaborative, participatory, and not being overly burdensome. And I've got on the screen just what I think are some of our objectives with collective learning. So it's about creating and protecting spaces for intentional reflection during their implementation. It's about bringing partners together for peer-to-peer learning and sharing. And through all of that, creating opportunities for partners to build networks within countries, within sectors, and we've certainly seen we've certainly received quite a lot of feedback that shows that does happen. How it works, so trying to be succinct here, you know, as I said, we are quite open and flexible to approaches. We want this to be funded partner-led, but we have been able to identify some common components of our approach. So we think that it's really important to create a common platform for partners so that they can relate within a collective learning process. They need to understand how they connect to each other, so that they understand how they're relevant. So if we're thinking about our grantees, they are different organisations of different sizes. They've all received different funding amounts. They have also different funding timeframes. They might be from different geographies. You know, our programmes are often quite broad themed, and so it's about creating a common platform so that people understand why they relate to each other. And it's surprising sometimes it can seem like they don't, and you actually can create a lot of common ground. And part of that is creating a real sense of belonging and community for funded partners as well. It's really important for funded partners to have ownership and to find the process empowering. So as I've said a few times, it's funded partner led. We don't generally participate as a I mean, we are involved in overseeing the process, but we don't have to be in the meetings and the workshops and the events. Sometimes we are with permission of funded partners if that is something that they want us to be, but it's more about protecting spaces where they can really truly express how they're feeling and to sort of address some of those power imbalances where, you know, through reports they might not be able to say what they really think. We've also recently piloted involving funded partners in the recruitment of their learning coordinators as well. So that's very much an early days thing, but it has been very interesting to do that. And then we think it's really important that they build relationships so that they can signpost to each other, interact outside of learning. It's a practical way for them to network and build connections between organisations. And we have seen examples of where they've been able to kind of come together and actually do additional work, create new projects, work on advocacy together outside of the learning space. And it's also a focus on practical learning that takes place throughout implementation. So collective learning takes place across the programme as it's implemented, which means that when they're connecting, they're doing at the same time. So actually the learning is really sort of timely, and it's something that they can go back, share with share as part of the collective learning process, and then go back and actually implement and try it out and share with the rest of their team. So it's about being practical and implementable. In terms of success factors that we've seen, we think it's really important to have a very strong external facilitator. So we've had the privilege of working with a variety of learning coordinators who are really good at this, really skilled at creating safe spaces for funded partners to share, to build relationships, and to create that sense of community. That sometimes it hasn't been the case. There have, it's a variety. I think reflecting on that, this is quite a new approach. Often the types of learning coordinators we've worked with, our evaluators have come from a different approach, and it takes a bit of time to get used to moving away from an accountability approach to more of this kind of equity-based, focused on the learning and it being practical and implementable, and for it to be sort of a safe space as well and open. We've also seen, so a lot of our collective learning to date has been implemented throughout pandemic. So a lot of it was implemented online. And whilst that was really useful, I think it allowed organisations to connect through some very difficult times. Since then, we've been able to make opportunities for funded partners to come together in person, and we've really seen the value in that. And I think the feedback we get is that it's great that we got to do this online, but you go so much deeper when you meet in person. And also just that we've always tried to be open to new and creative ideas. So we want it to be led by them. I think that funded partners do appreciate that. And so we are very open, we remain open to the ideas of funded partners and also the learning coordinators who bring their own expertise and experience as well. But it's not like it's a perfect approach. We certainly have different, we certainly have areas to improve. So a few that I've outlined is comic relief needs to be clear about what we're trying to fund. And I think that really speaks to the purpose of this talk. So balancing equity, evidence and trust. So we want this to be a focus on what funded partners want to learn, but we also need to be clearer from the onset what are our learning questions, and there are pieces of work going on to make that clearer as an organisation, I would say, but also for our team and for these types of initiatives. And also, yes, so a lot of our collective learning happens in program-specific spaces and not across those programs. And we see similar learnings that can be shared across thematic areas or across our programs. And we certainly know that we need to make more use of those learnings and those opportunities to share. So that is, hopefully I haven't gone over 7 minutes. I don't know, I haven't been able to keep track of time. But that is, in a nutshell, our approach to collective learning. So I'm hoping it's given some food for thought. Happy to answer any questions maybe at the end.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Corinna. And I'm afraid to say Asimina, our other speaker, is not able to join us. She was going to touch on a little bit about how Co-op Foundation use the DI data standard in their work, as well as how they've built involvement, engagement in developing their theory of change along with young people, and then even doing commissioning with young people together. And I think that speaks to some of the things, Corinna, that you mentioned around how you get the right evaluators too, or the right learning partners, and what's kind of maybe the cultural shift that we, as the kind of the consultants who come in, that we might need to do in order to kind of engage well in those spaces. So yes, so unfortunately we're not able to hear from Asimina, but we were running behind anyway, so it does ensure that we've got a bit of time for a Q&A discussion, as well as kind of capturing some of your ideas and examples. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now, who will guide us through that.
Lovely, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you so much, Corinna, for sharing your experience. It's really, it's really insightful to hear about how you've been doing these things in practice, alongside our kind of more theoretical, but hopefully also practical framework that we're sort of in the process of developing. I think Claire has already posted in the chat to say, please do share any questions that you might have, either for NPC or for Comic Relief, and we've got a little bit of time now to answer questions. So I'd encourage you either to raise your hand, use the raise hand function, or if you would prefer to write your type your questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer those. But we also are keen to sort of capture experiences and feedback, conscious that we've got a whole wealth of experience and insight in the room today. So we've created a Miro board, and yeah, my colleague Emma has just posted a link to that in the chat. So yeah, please do feel free to click on that link. And we're inviting you through that Miro board to share any examples that you might have from your own monitoring, evaluation, learning practice. or whether there's anything that you've heard today which you think could apply to your own work, or whether there are things that, you know, for you sort of remain unanswered questions that you would still like to know more about, because we've still got some research time left on our project. So we're keen to know what you think are the real sort of burning topics for you. I think given the time that we've got left, we've got about 20 minutes left in the session, but we need to sort of have a little bit of time to bring things to a close. We'll do the two things in parallel. I mean, please do share any questions that you might have, either through raising hand or putting that in the chat, or if you would prefer to get stuck into the Miro board. If you have any problems with the Miro board, please do flag that in the chat, and we can help with that. But the questions that we wanted to get your thoughts on there are, you know, are there any examples from your own measurement, evaluation and learning practice that you'd like to share? You know, we'd love to hear from you, and for you also to be able to hear from one another, you know, what you've tried, what you think has worked well, or what you think hasn't worked so well, but you know, you think is useful learning for the sector. Is there anything that you've heard or learned today that you'd like to try in your own practice? And, you know, what questions haven't we answered? What would you like to learn more about in this space? So please do engage with the Miro. But in the meantime, I don't know if we've had any questions in yet. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, question about a list of recommended learning partners. As a provider of learning partner support, I don't know whether that's something we can comment on. Corinna, thank you for sharing your answer. Is there anything you wanted to expand on there? I mean, maybe others who've used this could share any suggestions that they have in the chat.
I mean, I think, yeah, sorry, I just went ahead and answered that. I don't know if that's
please
actually
do. That's really helpful.
directed at us.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I just think it's such an individual tailored thing that is there a sort of list that we could put together? I'm not sure. Yeah, I'd be interested to know what NPC thinks about that as well, if they've kind of already got something, an idea of what they would put forward for that. But for me, it seems like each kind of initiative would be so specific that you might want to just go out and find the right person for each individual project. But yeah, also it's a very interesting question. I'm not really sure what I think.
I guess there's one thing I would add, which sort of comes out of the equitable evaluation work and kind of wider thinking about this, is about culturally responsive evaluation. So thinking about how the kind of, I guess, the profile of the evaluators or the learning partner, how that matches up with the kind of communities, whether there is that kind of understanding there, and that deep understanding. And I think for some, I guess, thinking depending on the areas in which you fund, that sort of insight and also kind of specialist knowledge can be much more important. So so I'm thinking if the evaluators or learning partners don't seem to have the right sort of backgrounds to bring to that, are there also ways that you can kind of bring that in other ways, or do they have suggestions for how they can bring that in other ways too?
Great. So I can see lots of people are getting stuck into the Miro, which is fantastic. Lots of useful things coming out. Thanks to this talk, we've been inspired to review what we ask and how we're using the data. Somebody has said, so that is great to hear. Somebody is commenting that they're thinking about bringing grantee partners together with an external facilitator, commenting that most of the evaluation is quite individual. So it's really useful to think about how we could help grantee partners to learn from each other too. Yes, that's really valuable. I mean, I'd be interested to ask Corinna, if I could come to you with a question. I mean, if you could talk a bit more about sort of the outcomes, I guess, of the work that you've been doing, you know, this approach that you've been taking. What have some of the outcomes of the work been? You know, what sort of differences have you seen for the organizations themselves and for your practice as a funder?
Yeah, I think I've sort of covered some of them in that I think the opportunities to connect and share lead to a sort of an immediate outcome of being able to adapt, as I think. And we've also kind of, what we're able to, what often happens is they'll come together and decide on what their final output might be. Sorry, it's saying that my internet isn't great, so I might just see if this helps. Outputs that they want to share. So it might be something that kind of outlines the key learnings that could be then turned into a toolkit that they're able to then use to influence the wider sector. We've most recently done that in one of our Sport for Change projects, and I think it's been really well received. Similarly, in one of our gender justice programs, they've come together and in a conference sort of been able to get deeper into movement building and kind of the advocacy space that they work in, and then create outputs that can then be wider shared. So I mean, I'm not giving very specific maybe a specific response to your question, because there's so many, I suppose, different possible outcomes to this, but I guess the focus is often on the funded partners, their sector, their field, where I think we aren't as good at understanding what the outcomes are for us is, I think, you know, Comet Relief has gone through a few changes over the past few years, and so we've been really trying to refine our understanding of what it is we're trying to learn, what it is that what our outcomes are, and we want to be better at that. So I think actually there's a bit of a work in progress really on how we sort of take the learning that's happening on the ground in action and apply that to our so that we have a better understanding of what outcomes we're able to achieve when it comes to social change. I think we're quite good though at understanding through this, we're able to take quite a lot of information from the collective learning approach in terms of how we're doing with funding practice. I think we do get quite a lot of feedback about how collective learning might be either helping, supporting, or where we could be improving as a funder. So hopefully that broadly answers your question, Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And as you say, I mean, I think I guess of the benefits and the outcomes must be quite sort of broad ranging. But no, thank you. That's really interesting to hear. Like more examples. Thank you. I can see there's some conversation in the chat about asking about examples. Claire is asking, are there examples of small funders doing this work well? Either small staff teams or small amounts of funding awarded, which I think, yeah, is really interesting when you're thinking about sort of this question of proportionality. And Claire, MPC Claire, I can see you've written an answer to this, but I don't know if you want to expand on that at all.
Yes, yeah. So I think it could be a strength. I think it can be a strength in some ways, being a smaller funder and doing this, and particularly where you're not funding so many organizations and where you are quite targeted in your focus too, which means I think that you can build up maybe stronger relationships with some of the organizations you're supporting, and you know, have kind of better, more in-depth conversations, and really there's fewer the link between the person kind of doing the learning and the kind of decision making is kind of smaller too. So it feels like that actually smaller funders can do this quite well. And there's a couple of examples that I've shared there in the chat, who I've seen kind of or we've spoken to, who I think take quite interesting approaches, and they're both quite targeted on particular funding areas. They're both actually Scottish funders, Maitri Trust and Catanac, but we're going to be including some examples kind of within the framework. So we've got a few case studies already. We're keen to get more case studies too. So thank you for sharing those examples on the Miro board, and please do share which organisation you're coming from as well, because it might be that we'd like to get in touch.
Great, thank you. I'm told I missed a raised hand earlier. My apologies. Sophie, was that you?
Yeah, you actually came on and then asked the question I was going to ask, which was just more around how would you measure the impact of taking a kind of collective learning approach? And if anyone in the room has kind of reflections on measuring kind of that convening, that networking, sharing learning, but you kind of touched on it anyway. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And so, yeah, my apologies for missing your raised hand. Claire, is there anything else that you wanted to feed in response to that question, or anyone else in the room?
Sorry, I was busy looking at the Miro board and some of the interesting examples coming in. So yeah, no, interesting to see some of the things being suggested. There's an interesting one around submitting learning through an online form and having common themes in a monthly check-in meeting. So it sounds like they're kind of really embedding a regular process for taking in that learning. Yes, I think often we're sort of gathering the data, but not necessarily using it. So it sounds like having that kind of structured approach to using it could be really helpful.
Mm. Okay. Any other questions from the room? We've got a few more minutes still. So we've got one question which I think has come from the Miro board, saying it'd be interesting to hear any experiences of moving away from accountability focus to learning focus with trustees, which I think, yeah, is a really interesting question, because I think we've heard a lot through the conversations we've been having as part of this work about the sort of different dynamics that funders are often grappling with, and particularly trustee boards. It can sometimes be challenging to bring trustee boards on that kind of journey. So yeah, I mean, Claire, shall I hand this to you initially, and then Corinna, if you wanted to feed in, or anybody else in the room that has experiences to share in response to that question.
Yeah, so I think it's not an easy question. It's obviously a big challenge for lots of organizations, and I think part of the challenge might be around how you actually, that learning doesn't always translate as well as the kind of accountability aspects when it's kind of moving up the organization and becoming kind of filtered down. So thinking about ways that you can present that learning in ways which are really engaging. There's an interesting example from, I think, Headwaters Foundation, who have an annual learning book, which I think kind of replaces their annual report, and that provides, I guess it distills their learning. It includes kind of key bits of data as well, and it provides a kind of very structured way that kind of their stakeholders, including trustees, but also external stakeholders, can see kind of what they've been doing, what they've been learning, and the kind of wider shifts that they've been seeing around the kind of outcomes they're aiming for. So I think thinking really consciously about how we're presenting our learning, and if we're able to kind of transmit it in more sort of compelling and sometimes concise ways too, can help kind of shift that balance.
Great, thank you. Another question about sort of managing requests to funded partners, and kind of managing the ask on their time for engaging in processes like the sort of collective learning example. And Corinna, I wonder if I can come to you with this question. This is about sort of how do you manage the requests of funded partners to engage, and the sort of demand that places on their time. Question about whether you fund time to engage, and what difference, if so, whether that makes a difference on their sort of engagement or response to the process.
Yeah, so we don't fund their time to engage because we're funding their project, which already, I suppose, so we didn't see that was something we necessarily needed to do, but we certainly have thought about how we're really upfront about what we're actually asking of funded partners when they are invited to be part of collective learning. It isn't compulsory, and there is absolutely no consequence if they decide not to be involved in it. So then actually sometimes it becomes a sort of, how do you sales pitch it as worth their time? And I think you have to work really closely with the learning coordinator on some of the essentials, just how much time do you actually need to commit? What are the expectations up front? What is it that we're trying to achieve through this? What might be the benefits to them? Maybe using examples from previous experiences, being clear on kind of our involvement as well. So it's not about accountability. It's not that Comic Relief is going to come in here every time you meet, we're listening, we want to know what's going on. So I think just setting some of that up and being really clear with it really up front. And then, you know, level of engagement, it's sort of a bit of a cyclical thing. You know, if you've got a really if you've been managed to engage funded partners in it in the first place, then the amount of engagement they put in is the amount they'll get out as well. So you kind of need to continue the momentum. And I think, you know, not everybody is going to get, you know, what we hope they get from it. And that's also fine. We have had funded partners drop off, but overwhelmingly we do get very positive feedback. And I think it, you know, in terms of what they're getting from it, it is those connections that they're getting to make with other organizations, feeling that they're not alone in certain problems, actually thinking outside of the box, outside of their perhaps slightly siloed thinking when they're only learning within their organization. So yeah, I think that's probably enough to say on it, but yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about upfront and being really clear from the onset.
Great. Yes. No, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think, you know, as you say, it's sort of being mindful of the kind of potential tension there of like the demand on the grantees' time, and making sure that there's a lot of transparency about, you know, what the process involves, what, you know, what the benefits might be for them, what, you know, what it might look like for them in practice, so that grantees can kind of make an informed decision about getting involved. That's all really really valuable stuff. Claire, is there anything that you wanted to come in on that question? Oh, you're on mute, Claire.
Apologies. Question, thinking about kind of funding time to engage. So with a funder we've worked with as a kind of evaluation and learning partner, the monitoring report and the reporting process, that's not something that they receive kind of extra funding for, but we did provide funding. We did kind of discussion sessions based on the kind of reporting data that we'd taken and kind of synthesized. And then we use that as a starting point for these discussion sessions, and they were compensated for participating in those. So things which I guess were over and above the usual expectations of what they might have expected kind of going into the grant too. So and yeah, I guess the level of compensation, we gave them, I guess, an hourly rate similar to the kind of at the same level as the kind of consultant rate too. So kind of valuing their time as consultants. But I think yeah, I guess within the regular monitoring requirements, I guess generally there wouldn't be an expectation of additional payment, but if you really feel like you're taking extra time for the requirements you're taking, I guess that's when you need to start thinking about kind of compensation too. Great,
thank you. Now I'm very conscious of time, so I think we'll sadly have to draw things to an end here, but I'm conscious we could keep on talking about this topic for probably hours still to come. And thank you so much to everybody who has engaged in the Miro board. We're going to leave the Miro board open, so if you know, maybe I'll go through a couple of points here, but you know, please do feel free to kind of spend a bit of time after the session going through that, and you know, see what others have said, and you know, if you've got other thoughts that you want to add in after the session, like please do. We'd love to hear from you. We've got some lovely examples on there. Somebody's talked about a learning process that they set up, where they have an online form where grantees can submit their learning. It's all presented back. They present back common themes in a monthly meeting, so encouraging grantees to learn from one another, which is really lovely. Somebody is talking about bringing together grantees in sessions at inception and the end of the delivery period, facilitated by the funder, but you know, the whole team attended, and thinking about you know, the implications of this conversation for sort of thinking about how, you know, their presence within those sessions might have enabled or hindered conversations, which is really interesting, sort of reflection on power dynamics. Lots of people talking about what they've been inspired to do, arranging learning and sharing opportunities with grantees, thinking about tailoring monitor evaluation and learning approaches to each grantee without adding extra burden, setting learning sessions where they as the funder are not in the room, which I think is a really interesting question. So thank you so much. And I'm sorry I've not got time to go through everything, but yeah, thank you so much for engaging. Thank you to the speakers and for all of you for coming along, and for London Funders for hosting and giving us the opportunity to share this learning. Do sign up for other Festival of Learning events if you've not done so already. There's lots of really exciting stuff coming. Keep in touch with us. Please do, sign up to the NPC mailing list or email either Claire or myself, and we'll put our email addresses in the chat. If you'd like to sort of stay in touch on this work, we'd love to chat and love to keep you in the loop when our output's coming out in September. And I think my colleagues also just posted a link to an event that we're hosting. This is a slight tangent, but an event that we're hosting in June, which is on a report exploring how charities are coping with a rise in children and young people seeking mental health support and how funders can best support in that area. So please do come along if that's an area that you're interested in too. Thanks so much for having us. Have a lovely day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.